Well, welcome everyone to state by state green priorities in affordable housing for tax credit programs. So glad that you could join us. Before we get started, I want to say a huge thanks to all of our sponsors who support our work and allow us to do these sessions. And a lot of these sponsors are helping you and your clients meet these sustainability programs that we're going to be talking about today within green affordable housing initiatives, especially our platinum top sponsors, Mitsubishi and Rheem. They can help projects decarbonize both single family, multifamily, mid-rise through air source heat pump technology, both heating the air and the water, even in the coldest of cold climates. So thanks to them and for their support. So again, welcome everyone to State by State Green Priorities in Affordable Housing and Tax Credit Programs. This course is brought to you by the Green Home Institute. The Green Home Institute is a nonprofit with a mission to empower people to make healthier and more sustainable choices in the renovation and construction of the places we live. We are a small but mighty team of 3, and I am Brett Little, the education manager here. I will be your moderator today. As always, this course is approved for multiple continuing education units, including all 5 pillars of green in our Certified Green Home Professional Designation program. AIA Health, Welfare, and Safety may make it applicable to your state-based design or contractor license. And a shout out to Sarah, our new other architect CU that we have added. So with that, I am very excited to welcome our speakers here today, Madeline McCullough and Ted Nedwick with the National Housing Trust. It's always been great to see all the work that has been coming out of NHT, and I've personally worked with someone from there for many years on green affordable housing initiatives. So I am very excited for their time, for them joining us. And Todd, Madeline, please take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Brett, and thanks everyone for joining. I can just briefly introduce myself. I'm Todd Nedwick. I'm the Senior Director of Sustainability Policy at NHT. So I lead our sustainability policy work, including our work with housing finance agencies, as well as our advocacy around the Inflation Reduction Act, building performance standards, as well as advancing other state and local policies and programs to support more sustainable, affordable housing. And I'll pass it over to Matt.
Hi, my name is Madeline McCullough. I am on our policy team with Todd. I serve as our program coordinator and analyst, helping with all things Inflation Reduction Act right now. I'm going to quickly pull up my screen so we can see our slides. Can everyone see these okay?
Looks good.
Awesome. So the purpose of this presentation is to walk through our policy team's 2023 QAP analysis and understand the sustainability trends across states. So for those that don't know, NHT, or National Housing Trust, is an affordable housing developer based in Washington, D.C. We bring together resident services, lending, policy, energy solutions, and development under one roof to create and preserve affordable homes, advance racial equity, reduce economic disparities, and preserve affordable homes and strengthen community resiliency. Like Todd said, we are on our sustainability team. I'm going to hand it over to him so he can do some level setting on the LIHTC program.
Sure. So we thought before we got too deep into our sustainability QAP analysis, we would kind of provide an overview of the tax credit program, the low-income housing tax credit program, to kind of level set. And Madeline, maybe you can go to the next slide. So the low-income housing tax credit program is the largest federal financing program for affordable housing. It's been around since 1986 and has resulted so far in nearly 4 million affordable homes, rental homes, created or preserved, serving nearly 9 million low-income households. And it's a federal tax credit program, so this is not an appropriations program. This is a tax credit authority program, and annually there's about $13 billion in federal tax credit authority that's made available to support affordable housing development. Next slide. So without getting too far into the weeds about how the LIHTC program works, I'll just thought I'd provide a quick overview. So this is a U.S. Department of Treasury program. It's not, a HUD program, which, HUD typically finances affordable housing, but this is a program through the U.S. Department of Treasury. The U.S. Department of Treasury issues tax credits to states. States determine what type of housing characteristics they want to encourage developers to pursue through what's called a Qualified Allocation Plan. So this is basically the state's policy for the various sort of selection criteria that governs the competition for tax credits. Housing developers competing for tax credits are going to strive to align their projects as much as possible to the selection criteria outlined in the QAP. And if a developer is able to get tax credits, they then sell those tax credits to investors who are looking for tax credits to offset their tax liability. And as a result of that sale of tax credits, the developer then is able to apply the equity to the financing of the development. And that equity essentially, lowers the amount of money that must be borrowed to fund construction, and that lower debt payments, is what allows developers to charge affordable rents. Next slide. So I wanted to just sort of provide some context in terms of, the affordable housing crisis. I think if we're going to talk about, advancing sustainability in the low-income housing tax credit program, it'd be helpful to sort of level set kind of the state of the affordable housing crisis that we're facing. So we have a shortage of about 7 million affordable rental housing units in this country. And the low-income housing tax credit program results in approximately 100,000 new or retrofitted affordable housing per year. So as you can imagine, that is really a drop in the bucket in terms of our affordable housing need. And so at that rate, it would take 70 years to meet the need for affordable rental housing. And that's assuming that there's no loss of existing housing. And we do know that we are losing affordable housing over time. Right now, the median age of the affordable rental housing stock is 44 years, which is the oldest it's ever been. And then we, of course, have thousands of affordable rental housing units at risk from the potential impacts from climate change, right? So just to underscore that there's a significant need for new affordable housing, and that we're just barely moving the needle in terms of our current affordable housing financing resources. Next slide. And that shortage of supply is really driving high housing cost burdens for low-income renters. So this chart is from the America's Rental Housing Report by the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and really shows that at this point we're at a really an all-time high in terms of renters that have either moderate or severe cost burden. So a moderate cost burden is spending more than 30% of your income on housing, and severe cost burden is spending 50% of your income on housing. And so I just wanted to underscore that fact because we're talking about a housing program that is really primarily intended to increase the supply of affordable housing. And so I think we need to be mindful of that as we're talking about strategies for really advancing sustainability. HFAs are really juggling their top priority of increasing the supply of affordable housing with other priorities like advancing sustainability, and are sometimes challenged in terms of what they can do because of concerns that they won't be able to produce as much affordable housing as is possible through this program. But despite that, we are seeing a lot of progress with advancing sustainability and affordable housing. And I will, Brett, do you have a question?
Well, you just want to clarify when you're talking about cost burden, is total cost of home ownership part of that? Now it's a renter, so obviously they're not responsible for maintenance. Maybe they are, but really I'm looking at like utility bills. Is that part of that burden when you're saying that in this slide?
Yeah, so in the rental housing context, it's the monthly rent and the cost of utilities that
Okay,
are
thank
considered.
you.
Yeah, sure. All right, with that, I think I'll pass it over to Madeline, who can talk through the results of our analysis.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. So since 2017, NHT has been tracking energy incentives and requirements in QAPs and has published 2 reports that outlines these trends, as well as a series of info briefs on specific topics from our 2023 analysis. So today we're going to be talking specifically about our 2023 work. The data from this presentation is from QAPs as of March 2023. We realize since then some states have released updated QAPs, but the information is still just as relevant. So we looked at 50 states as well as DC, Chicago, and New York City. So our analysis focused on several key elements. The first being third-party building standards, which are certifications established by independent third parties that provide developers standards as to how to incorporate sustainability elements into their project design and construction. So some states have minimum threshold building standard requirements for a project to be eligible to receive housing tax credits. And we looked at what certifications developers are incentivized to achieve in different states. The second topic is whole building energy performance standards. Having technical performance standards. So we examined which states require developers to reduce whole building energy consumption to achieve minimum energy savings compared to baseline data. The third was renewable energy. We're starting to see more and more states require or incentivize developers to install on-site renewable energy to offset building energy load and ensure low-income residents have access to clean, reliable, and climate-friendly energy sources. And finally, electrification. So what states are requiring or incentivizing developers to electrify and decarbonize their projects to ensure affordable housing is healthy and sustainable. So compared to our analysis in 2017 and 2020, there has been a significant increase in the number of states that explicitly incorporate green building standards in their QAP. These standards, like Enterprise Green Communities, Passive House, or Energy Star, provide clarity for developers on how to incorporate sustainability in project design and construction. And these standards also provide streamlined processes for the HFAs to advance energy and water efficiency standards across housing tax credit properties in their state. So by committing to obtaining a green building certification, the developer agrees to prioritize sustainable building design elements, such as high efficiency equipment, renewable energy, and environmentally friendly building materials. So while 46 states explicitly incorporate green building standards in their QAP, the standards look different across states. These are the 6 most popular standards HFAs included in their QAPs. They're applicable to both new construction and rehabilitation or preservation projects. The numbers reflected or reflect which states include these standards as an eligible building standard. In some states, a developer may be required to build to Enterprise Green Communities, but other states may award points for this standard. We also didn't differentiate here which states require which level of a specific building standard. So for example, LEED Silver or LEED Gold. We did not track Energy Star in 2017, but in our 2023 analysis, we found that 16 states referenced this standard either as a threshold requirement or eligible building standard. This is important because many of the IRA-related funding programs require Energy Star certified appliances or equipment to be eligible to receive funds. A full breakdown of the state-by-state standards can be found in our third-party building standard info brief, and we'll share a link to that later on. Brett?
Madeline, so in the other slide, it showed 46 states now, which I found to be highly surprising. Now on this side, I only see Enterprise in 32. I would assume no one's going to leave Enterprise out. I mean, they are the green affordable housing standard. So what that tells me is I'm curious if you're talking in that previous slide about standards, does that not necessarily mean full on third-party green building certifications? Does it also encompass other aspects?
So this is explicitly third-party building standards,
Okay.
but we did see that some states might have like their own state-specific standard. So
Okay.
maybe they're not including, maybe they might award points for a passive house, but the base requirement, the threshold requirement might be, for example, I'm making up a state, Washington's base standard that all developers have to build to.
Okay, so there might be maybe looking at this 18 states out there that just have their own kind of standard. Is that kind of maybe the quick way to look at this?
It could be, or maybe they just don't explicitly call out enterprise green communities as a threshold, but like the elements of their threshold align with enterprise green communities.
Right. Okay, well, thank you for clarifying that.
Sure. So the second element was energy performance. So to ensure the stability and sustainability of tax credit properties, it's important that you have good energy performance in your building. This doesn't just keep costs low for residents and for building owners, but it also ensures that buildings are operating efficiently. So you're spending less on maintenance. Some HFAs outline energy performance savings that projects must achieve to receive tax credits. This requires developers to set a target to energy consumption to an actual baseline that is determined through benchmarking data. So some QAPs may require a certain level of reduction in energy usage across properties, either as a percentage or through a HERS index score. The HERS index score tracks a building's energy efficiency. So for those unfamiliar with this method, the lower the score, the more efficient a property is. So for example, if your index score is 90 or 95, you have a pretty inefficient property. The arrows on the right show on average what energy use reduction HFAs want to see across their projects. The reductions differ between new construction and rehab or preservation projects. And rehab and preservation projects, their reduction is based on prior year's energy performance through benchmarking and data collection. And new construction projects show a reduction in energy based on the state's building energy efficiency standards. Some states might address energy performance through third building standards shown on the previous slides, but this map illustrates the states that explicitly include energy performance in their QAPs. So 14 states require new construction and 9 states incentivize new construction energy performance improvements. 15 states require rehabilitation or preservation projects, and 7 states incentivize these projects to have a lower energy use. From our 2017 analysis, we saw 15 new states include renewable energy sources in their QAPs. 10 states require renewable energy be incorporated into the project, whether by installing solar panels or requiring a project to be solar ready. 13 states offer incentives for incorporating renewable energy, most commonly by providing points for the percentage of the building or units or common area energy demand that is offset by energy generated from renewable energy sources. And the most common form is through solar PV. A small number of states also require that savings generated from on-site renewable energy must benefit residents, either as a percentage or a dollar amount of savings on their utility bills. And while the most common form of renewable energy seen in QAPs is solar, other states are beginning to incorporate other sources like wind or geothermal in their QAPs. So an example of what this might look like in practice would be Washington, D.C. So in Washington, D.C.'s QAP, the Department of Housing and Community Development has leveraged existing district programs and policies to ensure solar is incorporated into housing tax credit properties. So DHCD's 2021 QAP requires all LIHTC projects either include solar on site or qualify as a solar-ready building. And then the final element that we looked at was electrification. So electrification was not previously tracked in our QAP analysis, but we are beginning to see an increase in states explicitly calling for electrification measures in new construction and rehabilitation or preservation projects. Electrification in QAPs typically involves either electrifying individual building systems or appliances like your heating and cooling system or stoves, dryers, things like that. Or it shows up as construction electric-ready buildings and all electric baseline construction standards, meaning that the project is 100% free of on-site fossil fuel energy. We're also starting to see states include requirements or incentives for EV inclusive elements. So this looks like on-site EV chargers. We saw 6 states award points if the project is equipped with an EV charging station, and 1 state has requirements that projects must be EV ready. This typically shows up as a percentage of the parking spots at a property. You must have X number of EV chargers on site. Brett?
Yeah, if you're going to finish the electrification, I had an electrification question. So
Sure.
Well, did you also track the disincentivization of electrification? By that, I mean, we understand that the way that the utility allowances are structured may be archaic. For example, if you say you're doing electrification, they only think of that as baseboard electrification. So it's always going to penalize you in your utility allowances because they don't have a way to consider the fact that heat pumps exist, let alone cold weather climate heat pumps. I won't name the state, but that's one example I've seen in real world terms where it's actually a disincentive. Have you seen anything like that or track it?
I'll defer to Todd.
Yeah, I can jump in there. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. We have not included that in this analysis. Often the HFA will defer to the public housing utility allowance schedule. And so sometimes it's just not sort of on the radar of the HFA. But it is an issue, and I do think there needs to be advocacy efforts to push the public housing authorities to have more appropriate utility allowances to not disincentivize electrification.
Thank you.
And then another example of what all electric or electric ready affordable housing looks like is in New York State. So the state's Division of Housing and Community Renewal outlines all electric requirements through the state's LIHTC threshold requirements. So this is applicable to all LIHTC properties in the state. So for new construction and adaptive reuse projects, they must utilize high performance all electric heating and cooling and domestic hot water systems, as well as all electric appliances. And for substantial rehabilitation projects, they have to install all electric appliances like ranges, cooktops, ovens, and clothes dryers. So like Todd said, LIHTC funding is limited. It's meant to subsidize the cost of building low-income housing units. It doesn't cover the full cost, but there still are significant opportunities to further the impact of LIHTC for America's affordable housing market. So the first is that it can be designed to target specifically a state. So since they are designed and administered by states, the agencies are able to use the application as a tool to address specific needs, concerns, and priorities. So we've seen this in a way to help meet a state's climate goals, to ensure that buildings are constructed to be sustainable against weather impacts, like if there's lots of flooding in a state. And it also can be used to address the social needs of a low-income community. Unrelated to sustainability standards, states will often include points or requirements for certain resident services that properties must offer to make sure that it's providing more than just a home for low-income residents. So overall, the QAP plays a crucial role in states to create and preserve housing that also strengthens communities. Existing QAP elements can also be used to leverage and prime developers to take advantage of IRA funding. So things like your building standards, your green building standards that you require, or the energy performance requirements. These can be aligned with IRA programs to map whether IRA programs require Energy Star certified programs or appliances or systems, as well as energy savings and performance outlined in the home energy rebates through Department of Energy. IRA program administrators have also been providing guidance that helps outline how to best structure IRA funds with LIHTC capital stacks. We saw guidance recently come out from DOE to make sure that LIHTC properties can best take advantage of the rebates. President Biden's budget also invests $37 billion to expand the LIHTC program. So this will help create and preserve more affordable homes across the country. And Todd earlier in one of his slides had a a chart that outlined how the LIHTC process works. Within that process is a commenting period. So when states are releasing the next draft version of their QAP, they open up a public commenting period where anyone can submit comments to the QAP in its draft form. So if you think that your state isn't doing enough in terms of energy performance, in terms of incorporating renewable energy in affordable housing properties, you think their third-party building standards aren't doing enough to make energy or make properties perform more efficiently, you can submit comments to your HFA, asking them to consider those elements in their final draft and final version. It's a great way to do state-by-state advocacy work as well, to make sure that they're targeting the needs of the state. So that's all we have for this afternoon. We've included my email and Todd's email in case you all have any questions after today. And there's also a link to our website that includes the info briefs on all of the elements we talked about this afternoon, as well as a few others such as tenant protections and digital equity that our team worked on.
And I'll just add for the policy briefs include, in addition to a discussion of the trends of these various sustainability elements, we have tables in each that outline exactly what the requirements are for each state HFA. So that data is in there for each of these topics.
Well, great. Well, thanks for going over that, and let's jump into some additional questions here as they come up. I was kind of thinking about what you just said, Madeline, about the DOE having resources for discussing the alignment of the Inflation Reduction Act and the low-income housing tax credit programs. I kind of started quickly looking to see if I could find that link real quick. Is that something you all do you know where that guidance has come from? Is that something you'd be able to share either now or maybe later?
I can pull up the link really quickly for it.
Okay. And on that note, I know one of the conversations we've seen out there is that the theory is that in many cases these teams are already doing pretty closely what they need to be doing, especially on the 179D $5 per square foot tax credit, and to some extent the $5,000 in 45L tax credit under the Inflation Reduction Act. But one of the biggest concerns has been, getting that full $5,000 per unit under 45L for DOE Zero Energy Ready certification, which is, of course, the requirement of the Davis-Bacon wages, right? Or as I like to call them, living wages. But there's a different term for that, a more there's a technical term. But either way, what we continuously hear is, if we were to pay Davis-Bacon wages, the project would never pencil. So I'm just curious if what you've seen out there or heard out there, anything in regards to the studies you've been doing, are there any QAPs that are actually requiring those types of wages to be paid so it's easier? What are you seeing?
Yeah, so we haven't done a deep dive into that. I can tell you that DC, for example, requires all projects that get any sort of city funding to meet Davis-Bacon. So there's one example at least, but we have heard concerns from HFAs that applying Davis-Bacon will complicate the financing, because Davis-Bacon it doesn't just apply to that portion of the project that's funded through the federal resource. It applies to the entire project, right? And so that kind of compounds the challenge there. So
yeah. And then you mentioned the opportunity for state-by-state advocacy, which is great, obviously, and having everybody go out and get involved and get engaged at their state level when these housing agencies come up for public comment, which they're required to do, and getting involved in that, not just from a sustainability standpoint, but I know even our Michigan Energy Efficiency for All, MIFA Coalition, had DEI effort conversations long ago, back even before COVID. And so this is a great time to just figure out what's missing. And so I'm glad you brought that up. And I want to give a shout out to our friends at the Midwest Building Decarbonization Coalition, who are they have a QAP LIHTC team as well that's engaged in the Midwest, that you should encourage in getting into. But I'm wondering, so you had mentioned Treasury sort of controls this program, which was new to me. I thought it was HUD. So I learned something. And I've been doing this for a long time. But, I'm curious then, if Treasury controls this program, what opportunity is there either for, the executive administration or the legislature or Treasury themselves to implement more sustainable changes, so that rather than relying on the states to implement these, if some aren't, that it could be done just at a higher level? What have you seen with that, or what opportunities are there? Or can that even happen? So
Yeah, so maybe it would help to provide some background and sort of Treasury's role in the tax credit program. So there is in statute requirements for HFAs to consider certain selection criteria. And one of those criteria is energy efficiency. So there is precedent in terms of, federal government saying that this is a priority that should be considered in the QAPs. There isn't any sort of enforcement process though, right? So first of all, there's no definition or standard that Treasury has adopted that would qualify as energy efficiency in the QAP, and there's no formal process for Treasury to review QAPs and kind of weigh in. And they don't, they can't say, this QAP is not good. They just don't do. That's not part of the process, and so that would be a significant change if they are to sort of try to enforce more focus on sustainability. So that's just some background there. I mean, it's not impossible, I would say. I think Treasury's perspective has been that states have different housing needs, different housing priorities based on various housing markets, and that they're really, deferential to the state's housing finance agencies in terms of aligning their program with those priorities that are most relevant to their markets. So that's just sort of the kind of current status of the program, and kind of speaks to some of the challenges that we might encounter if we try to push for more sustainability requirements.
Yeah. And then a question came up, kind of going back to the IRA, and they were saying perhaps there are some states that are actually penalizing projects, whether, I'm assuming unintentionally, trying to use the 45L. And so they were just curious if there's any strategies or conversations that can be had to, as they're reaching out to their state to help avoid this.
Yeah, so it's a conversation that we've had with housing finance agencies, and sort of the goal is to kind of strike a balance in terms of, you don't want to, if a developer brings in an IRA resource, for example, you don't want to then sort of decrease the amount of resources coming from the housing agency as a result of that. So there's got to be sort of a balance in terms of, the developer is benefiting from these additional resources, and there's also some savings for the HFA's perspective as well. So those conversations are happening. I think that still, despite the fact that we've been talking about the Inflation Reduction Act for a year and a half or so, it's still new, and the funding is not all available yet. So I think those conversations will ramp up as it becomes more reality. The dollars are there, and figuring out best how to integrate into the HFA financing process.
Yeah, and we're hoping to have more conversations around utilization of IRA and affordable housing. So So yeah, more conversations to be had there. Now let's kind of take it down to the city or county level. If I'm understanding right, when I read your report just quickly, you had mentioned you looked at all the states and then maybe 3 cities. Are there LIHTC city programs out there, or what was I reading about that?
Yeah, so in New York, Illinois, and of course DC,
Well, yeah.
uh, in Illinois, in New York, Chicago, the state has determined that Chicago should get an allocation of of this part of the state allocation for them to
Mhm.
allocate. In the same situation in New York. So it's pretty rare, but that's yeah. Those are the
Yeah.
two.
So, it made me wonder, and something I've always thought about is, um, are you seeing, because I looked at your list, right? I saw the need, right, versus what LIHTC impacts, right? It's so small.
Mhm.
What do you see? And so it sounds like perhaps if New York City and Chicago are getting an allocation, they're probably taking away from the overall pot, right? It's probably not extra funds, but
Right,
it's probably, hey, we're taking some of the funds and then they get to sort of make their own local decisions. Is that
right,
how I'm
right.
under-
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
So yeah, that would maybe be an interesting thought. Like, is that something, apparently then that's up to the state, I'd imagine. So if we had a city like wherever, Cincinnati, Ohio, or Grand Rapids, Michigan, they wanted to lobby their state to say, hey, we want set asides in our own city. That would be a conversation between the city and the state, not necessarily a directive of the federal government, correct?
That's correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But what other opportunities are there out there that you've seen where are there any kind of like mimicking LIHTC programs that are established at state levels that can add to the pot? Have you seen
Yeah,
anything like
yeah. So there are, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there are states that have state tax credit uh, programs. So similar
that?
in nature in terms of allocating state tax credit authority to support financing affordable housing. And typically that provides another funding source within the capital stack of the LIHTC um, project.
Mhm.
So I think it's rare for state tax credit programs to be financing housing separate from the federal low-income housing tax credit programs. Typically considered a source within the capital stack to sort of build out all the funding that's needed to build the project. Kind of gap funding.
And then just to kind of follow up on the question we got from the city and municipality, is any other suggestions, just since we have you here, for municipalities to leverage state resources to enhance or advocate for more equitable and sustainable housing?
Yeah, well, I think in the context of the tax credit program, where we're seeing progress in terms of sustainability, it's typically when there's a state uh, clean energy goal. So, achieving net zero emissions
Mm-hmm.
by a certain year. I think to the extent that there are similar clean energy goals at the local level, I think that could be, you know, uh, uh, support the argument that the state HFA should be more um, aggressive in terms of the sustainability requirements that they include in the QAP.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other factors that we see driving sustainability focus in QAPs um, is access to resources. So where there are additional resources that can be brought into a project, um, whether that be utility energy efficiency resources, or in the case of DC, we have a very strong rec market. So there's a lot of resources available for renewable energy. That makes it a lot easier for the Department of Housing and Community Development in DC to basically require developers to include renewable energy in their projects. So to the
Yeah.
extent that there are complementary resources, and hopefully IRA will kind of play that role, that helps to move the HFA in the direction of looking at more aggressive sustainability requirements or incentives.
I'll
Yeah.
add two. The hope is that as IRA programs launch in states, there will be a lot more collaboration with state energy offices and housing finance agencies. And part of those IRA program designs require community input. And that's another opportunity for municipalities or cities or even just developers to reach out to their state agencies to advocate for certain program design elements or considerations as they're finalizing what those state specific programs will look like.
Mm-hmm. Another question that came in here is which states are pushing the envelope from a sustainability point of view and have real impacts on the construction cost been evaluated? So for example, this individual is saying what they've learned from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, that, for example, they have added passive house. So I think, in that case, when you're saying pushing the envelope, they're probably really referring here to, updating to the passive house standard. And then they're saying that hasn't really resulted in a huge cost increase. And so, their question is, why are other states not pushing the envelope similarly? And given that, I will give a shout out to Michigan, where I'm here. We have passive house adopted as our highest level. It's a slow uptake. Illinois, I think, has had it for quite some time. But either way, as this individual is pointing out, not a lot of construction cost is being added. But I know in our perspective, when we say passive house and we say what needs to be done, instantly the developer says that can't be possible, right? It's not affordable. And they don't seem to go through even the costing analysis to figure that out. It's just really a mentality. So I, a bit complaining here a little bit, but just adding to that conversation, how is it, what is the barrier here for the states to push this envelope? Is it because of developer pushback saying, no, we can't afford to do that, but without really, garnering any of the facts? I don't know. Like, what are you seeing out there in your conversations as far as the passive house adoptions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot more HFAs that have included passive house, as our analysis shows over the last several years. And hopefully that will result in more data that can be used to demonstrate the cost parity. I think, for many developers, this is not something that they're familiar with. They're not, they need help understanding, what's involved in the passive house, for example, or the other sustainability opportunities. And so I think there is a need to engage the developer community, hopefully with, more and more data and to make the case that this is not as heavy a lift as you would think, especially in new construction. I think when it comes to retrofitting existing buildings, that's a little bit more of a challenge.
Right.
And that does require, additional resources, for example, to go all electric in multi. So.
What are some of the other major challenges that a developer should consider with QAP projects that you can think of, or would be willing to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that typically the tax credit equity is not going to cover, depending on whether it's a 4% or 9%, will not cover the entire cost of the development. So typically, developers have to bring in various other gap funding sources, and so that's a challenge. And the more costly the project is, the more resources that are needed, and typically it could come to like 8 different funding sources, which obviously creates a bit of a headache for the developer in terms of managing that and coordinating all the various compliance requirements of each funding source. So that's certainly a challenge.
You mentioned 4%. I'm glad you brought that up. I completely slipped my mind. I know here in Michigan, one of our big green upgrades to our QAP several years ago included the requirement that the 4% follow the sustainability standards, whereas before they didn't. How much of your report sort of differentiated these standards you mentioned in 9% versus 4%, or can you just speak to that briefly?
Madeline, do you want to weigh in on our
And maybe
research?
before you do that, for the people who are like, what did he just say? What is 4% versus 9% briefly? So
Yeah, so basically 4% provides about 40% equity to a project. 9% provides, I think, typically 70% equity to a project. So the 9% tax credits are, very competitive because of the fact that it does provide so much equity. And most states, the QAP might only apply to the 9%, and the 4% might not have to meet some of the requirements or the incentives in the QAP. We're seeing that change because there's more competition for 4%, because for a 4% tax credit deal, you have to also include tax exempt bonds. And the bond caps, states are hitting their bond cap limit. And so that then basically means there's much more competition. There's not as much credits to go around. And that then requires HFAs to look at sort of how to apply selection criteria to figure out how to allocate 4% tax credits to projects. So we're seeing that more and more 4% credits, developers are subject to some of the threshold requirements that have been applicable to the 9%. I don't know if we track that though in our report, Madeline, if you.
No, to your point, Todd, the QAPs are typically for the 9%. In some cases, it might be this requirement or this incentive is applicable to both 9% and 4%. For example, the New York example with the all electric threshold requirements is applicable to both 9 and 4%. But in most cases, it's what the data we presented on is what's required or incentivized for 9% projects.
Got it. Thank you so much. There was just some additional chat that I wanted to bring up. Some just a reminder from our good friends over at HUD that the GRRP is out and taking applications. So I've always looked at HUD's green programs as almost like federal LIHTC, right? Applications. I know that saying that is not accurate, but it's also the closest thing I can wrap my brain around to say, yes, they're giving you dollars to improve affordable housing, and there are some green aspects to that. So have you all seen the ability on that note for HUD sorts of green funding? Like I know there's the HUD green mortgage insurance rate reduction, MIP. There's now GRRP. There's healthcare. Are those able to be leveraged with LIHTC, or are you really just having to pick one or the other?
Yeah, no, I think GRP in particular, the way HUD designed it, really supports integration with low-income tax credits. So there's, a couple of the competitions actually require building owners to be pursuing a recapitalization, which typically will include tax credits. So yeah, we think that the program is been designed very well to support integration.
Well, I'm not seeing too many other questions, but we do still have some more time for more. But as a reminder, real quick, for those of you watching this, we are recording it, so you'll be able to access the recording on demand if you missed anything or want to catch it again or share it with friends or colleagues or help post it on social media and help us get the word out. For those of you watching this recording, not right now, but in the future on demand, make sure to take your quiz with an 80% passing rate, and you will receive your continuing ed certificates. For those of you watching it here today, when we close out, take the survey that pops up. Please take that survey for your CUs, as well as check your spam from certs@gutenbergcerts.com over the next couple of days. You'll receive your continuing ed certificate there, as long as you've been here for the entire CU hour. And as always, a huge thanks to our board of directors, our volunteers, our executive director, Jose, Reina, and all of our top tier sponsors who are helping your projects, your sustainability projects, meet the sustainability goals of the QAP and improve decarbonizations, especially our top tier sponsors, Ream and Mitsubishi Electric. So what the National Housing Trust, what's your big, I mean, while we're here, what are you all working on? What's the big push right now to solve this affordable housing crisis that we have? What should people know? How do they get involved? What should they be doing? I need you to tell me right now, how do we solve this, Ted and Madeline? Putting you on the spot.
Yeah, that's well, certainly people can get engaged in NHT's work. We have a newsletter that we put out. You can go to our website and sign up for that. I mean, I think from our perspective, Madeline and myself, our work right now is really focused on ensuring that the IRA resources can be accessible for affordable multifamily housing. We're working with some of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund awardees on that. Madeline has been leading a IRA boot camp for HFAs to kind of get them engaged and informed about what the opportunities are here. So I think, we're really focused on maximizing as much as possible, getting some of that resources into affordable housing and kind of creating transformational change from that, making people more comfortable with sustainability and sort of seeing projects come to fruition to really kind of increase understanding about how to do this and what the actual costs are. So.
Great. And where can people go to find and access the full detailed reports of what we were talking about here today?
I will put a link in the chat for them now.
Okay.
I just put in for a link for our IRA Bootcamp homepage that has
great.
like recordings of all of our past webinars where we talk about the different programs and then different elements of the IRA, like resident engagement, energy efficiency, decarbonization, benchmarking, all those things. But there's also a link to a toolkit that has a variety of NHT developed or industry developed tools and resources that provide additional information on, energy efficiency, decarbonization, but also the IRA. And we have contact information there. If you have questions about the resources, if you think something's missing, things like that. It's always being updated as needs are identified. But the most recent link will take you to our QAP analysis LIHTC homepage. And if you scroll down a bit, you can see the specific info briefs that provide much more in-depth information on the different elements and the state-by-state charts that Todd mentioned at the end.
Great. And while we were going through that, a couple other quick clarifications and questions came in before we wrap up. There was just a clarification is, are you saying that the 4% or 9% involved a supply and demand kind of situation?
So with the 4%, because there's a requirement that 4% tax credits have to be paired with taxes on bonds. If the bonds aren't available, then the tax credits aren't available. And so that's sort of the challenge that we're seeing in certain states. It's not everywhere, but there's that bond cap that states are hitting. So that reduces the amount of bonds available to support 4% tax credits.
And then a great point came up here, and that is both the Inflation Reduction Act, 45L and 179D didn't seem to get the federal direct pay treatment like our good solar and geothermal friends did. Do you know if the IRS is going to issue any clarification to correct that, and whether or not you know that? My understanding is that nonprofits who are doing LIHTC are in a better position than perhaps nonprofits who are just doing traditional affordable housing development, where they typically have for-profit investors that can instead benefit from 45L or 179D. So it's a two-part question. Do you know if that's going to get fixed? And then second, isn't it pretty true that 45L and 179D just gets swept up by one of their for-profit partners and can be used that way?
Yeah, so on the first point, the legislation actually basically said which tax credits are explicitly eligible for the direct pay. So it's not, it would take legislation to fix that. Treasury can't just sort of clarify. And then, yeah, so it is true that, to the extent that the tax credit is not, a developer, nonprofit developer is not eligible for direct pay, they can basically syndicate or sell their tax credits to their for-profit partners, which would, they would be able to use their tax credit to offset their tax liability. So that's an approach to get it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So, well, great. Madeline, Todd, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate the research you all did here and coming on here to talk about it and getting the word out and everything that National Housing Trust is doing. It's greatly needed. So thank you for doing that work and spending some time with us. And did you have any other final parting thoughts before we wrap up, or otherwise maybe just remind us again, where can people go to reach out and get a hold of you?
Yeah, just again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the analysis we did, or if you want additional information. Our email addresses are here. Happy to be in touch.
Great. Todd Nedwood, Madeline McCullough, National Housing Trust, thank you so much for your time. Take care, everyone. We'll see you on the next event next week. So goodbye.
Thank you.